So you might have noticed I kind of changed the way I've been doing these intros for the longer project builds, and that is I only really do an intro in the beginning because doing an intro at every video, it kind of gets redundant. But for this one, I'm doing an intro because you might have noticed, I believe this is the 6th video, which means I've been posting this for 6 weeks. I haven't worked on these for 6 weeks. The reason for that is these and the built-in below it are going into a newly constructed home and they are experiencing delays, so that translates into myself experiencing delays. It's one of those things that's kind of unavoidable. I'm lucky in the sense that now in the new shop I have more space, so it hasn't really affected my productivity yet. The projects I'm working on are smaller pieces, so this stuff being over here is not that much of an issue. But I mention it just because this will be the last video of this series, and they're obviously not stained or finished, which means when I eventually get the stain color from the customer, I will be staining and finishing these, and I'll just upload that video somewhere down the road when it's ready. I really don't like breaking up these videos. It kind of ruins the continuity of the channel, but it is what it is. And I knew people would be asking about it, so I figured it was easier to just mention that in the beginning of this, that this will be the last installment of these vanity builds for the time being. But eventually I'm hoping to get that finished piece up there where these are stained. I don't think they're getting stained dark or anything like that. I think they're doing a very light brown on there. So they will look different, and then obviously a clear coat for protection, but that's kind of where this project is going to stand. So the first part of this video is going to be permanently attaching the feet. So you can see in the front, like I had shown in one of the earlier videos, I accounted for putting this tenon in the frame. So you can see this one fits in there perfectly. It's exactly what I wanted. The problem was in the back, I didn't account for that. So I was going to have to make some adjustments. Before I did that, since I had this on its back, I just cleaned up the bottom, just remove all the glue marks and whatnot. The bottom piece of our furniture like this, especially with plumbing going through the backside, you're never going to see, but I do like to clean up my marks. And then as you can see, I have to remove a portion of the panel of the plywood that came in the back. I should have trimmed it off like I did the front. This was not a huge mistake. It was an easy enough fix, but it would have been easier to have had the forethought to trim the front as well as the back. So you can see I'm just removing a little bit. At this point, that piece of plywood's only about 1/2 of an inch. So it was easy work to do with a chisel, and plywood usually flakes off messily but easily because it's in layers. So you can see that's all I did. I just removed a little bit, but the problem I have now is when I put that partition in to shore up that edge, that should not have gone all the way to the back either, so I just had to trim the tenon a little bit and then it fit in place. So a lot of times you'll see people will say that woodworking, a lot of it is just fixing your mistakes, and it's quite true. So there will be mistakes on every project. It's just figuring out clever ways to fix them. So like I said, that was a little bit of a bummer when I went to go put them in the back and they didn't fit, but was an easy enough fix. And then I could just attach glue to these tenons. You could see I have a nice amount of glue surface. I could prop up the edges. And the nice thing about a cabinet like this that's so heavy, I don't even have to put clamps on these. The weight of the cabinet and gravity will keep those pretty stable for myself. So the way I dealt with the bottom plinth being too big was I had to shim out my front portion there, and then you could see by shimming it out 3/4 of an inch, I created this little bit of a ledge. And then that bottom plinth, you could see I'm going to cut it where that mark is, and that's how I solved the issue here. It was just some red oak I put on there. Now the problem with this was I couldn't have made it that depth in the beginning because I needed the cabinet where I'm putting the face frames, the facades for all the drawers to be the dimension that it is. So shimming out that corner was the best way to do it. I guess in retrospect I could have had that one edge be a little bit longer, but I would have had to shim out this inside edge anyway. So that was an easy fix. I had to reapply some of the edge banding I had to take off to do that shim. But then all of that worked out. I was able to trim down the plinth so it didn't look so unproportional. And then I could put those drawer boxes back in. So for the drawer boxes, they're going to get 1/2 inch fronts, and then that is going to be trimmed out with 1/4 inch material. And like I said, I'm working off of a photo, so all of this is matching what's in a photo. So all I did was I got some 1/2 inch ply. So then you could see my rough opening is a little less than 9 7/8, and I did all these fronts based on all the separate openings because they were a little off at this point depending on how I hung the doors. So all I did was I cut this plywood down to that dimension and I subtracted a 1/16 of an inch from either side. Then I edge banded the edges. You can see that the edge banding doesn't add a lot of dimension to these pieces, so that's kind of how I went about doing this. I got my rough opening, I subtracted a hair over of a 1/16 of an inch from either side, so a heavy 1/8 is what I took off that dimension, and then I edge banded the sides, and then I cut it down based on my vertical height. This process is much easier if your opening frame is as square as possible. You can go through and make adjustments on all these door fronts, but my opening frames were fairly square on all of these, and it made my life so much easier. So the shims I'm using for my 1/16 inch are pennies. They work really well for stuff like this. And then I just have blue tape on the side. So I basically have the entire width, and then I'm going to divide that by 3. And that is going to be how I'm going to cut these. So each of my panels are about 6.29 inches, which I evened out to 6 1/4, and I could go through and cut all these. So I have allotted for the 1/16 of an inch on the top and the bottom, and the blade is going to remove an 1/8 of an inch for these two partitions in the middle, which will even out to be about a 1/16 of an inch reveal for my center portions as well. Now I'm working from top to bottom, and any changes I had to make on the height I made on the top one because it will be hidden the most by the overhang of the cabinet. So there will be minor adjustments to make on all of this, but with all of this trimmed out, you can see I have all of my pennies in place, and it was looking pretty good at this point. You can see how if your verticals aren't square, you'll get a thicker reveal top to bottom, but like I said, mine were pretty good to start with. So then, like I said, I'm going to work top to bottom and make any changes. This row I didn't have anything to do, but some of the other ones I had to change a little bit of the height on the top. And I'm just going to attach all of these with double-sided tape. I'm putting my pennies back in place so I can get all of my accurate reveal. And then, like I said, I'm attaching it with double-sided tape. So I'll do that all the way up. And I did this in sets of 3. So you can see I'm going to do this one at first. And then I could add the trim. So like I said, there's the double-sided tape. This stuff sticks pretty well. And then I could pop these out. I didn't get good footage of this, but basically I'm just popping these out. I'm being careful because this tape isn't perfect. I'm countersinking some holes, and then I'm putting 2 screws to hold this front face in place for the time being. The hardware that goes through this will also hold these in place as well, but for the time being, just putting 2 screws in these because the size of these drawer fronts will work just fine. So then that row you can see I have trimmed out, and you could see the thickness of the trim will then put this in the same plane as the front of the doors. So all I did was, once those false fronts were screwed in place, I just did some rough sanding on all of this to kind of get it out of the way. It's easiest on a big piece like this to try and sand as you go, so you don't have to sand the entire piece at the end. And then I got these strips of 1/4 inch oak that were the exact same width I needed. I believe they were 1.5 inches from Lowe's. Something like this to make in the shop will take quite a bit of time for myself. I'd have to plane down material, joint material. I don't have a bandsaw, so I can't resaw it. So I'd have to cut it down on the table saw, and I'll lose a lot of material with that curve. So I think these were like $3 a piece at Lowe's. I kind of found them by accident. I didn't even know they made stuff like this and sold it at Lowe's. And they weren't the the bow in them didn't really matter because I was going to be cutting them down into such small pieces. So this was a nice find that saved me a lot of time. And all I'm going to do is line them up with the front of the face. Like I said, I'm making all of these individually. I'm not cutting all of these at once because each one of these drawer fronts is going to be slightly different. And then I could just trim out the front that way. You could see I'm going to cut my 2 verticals based on my vertical length on the front, and then once I have those done, I'm going to glue them in place, and then I can measure and cut my horizontals. So that is how I trimmed out the front of these. Obviously we're sticking with the oak so that when I stain it, oak will take the stain really well and it will all match quite well. See, I'm just using my fingers to make sure everything's in the same plane, and then I could take those strips and measure and cut for those as well, and then glue them in place. So pretty simple process. I believe I did 1 cabinet one day and 1 cabinet the other day because work like this can get pretty monotonous, going through and adding all the false fronts, making adjustments, and then trimming out the fronts. But I was really trying to avoid using any sort of visible hardware on here because even though they sell patch for every sort of species of wood, it's never really a perfect match. And then I have a very heavy metal weight in the shop, so I'm using that on each drawer front essentially as a clamp to clamp down that front while it dries. And when it's dry, I can pop the finished one back in the cabinet. And then there, like I said, the orange portion of these slides have multiple adjustments you can make. And there were a couple that I was able to just mess with the up, down, and left to right adjustment in order to get that reveal perfect. But that is basically how that cabinet came together. And like I said, I did 1 cabinet one day and 1 cabinet the other. If you get off a little bit, you can set up a little bit of a shim on your table saw and trim these things down if your cabinet's not square. All of that is very doable, and I have done it before, which is why I stress to try and get it as square as possible because it's just a much easier process when your openings are as square as possible. And then the little bit I had left to do was finishing up the back. I cut a piece of 1/2 inch maple ply because you won't see the back, and maple ply is cheaper than oak ply. This was 25 inches tall as the opening for the back. And then I trimmed down these side pieces because I left them long when I originally cut them. It just makes life a little bit easier. It's hard to tell in the video, but the 2 edge panels I intentionally made so they're longer than all of my central panels so that the backer will inset into there. But that also means that this back edge will have exposed ply. So I just edge banded the back edge of this before attaching that backer. You can see I'm kind of using these for storage at the moment because they've been in my shop for so long. But I could put that edge banding on there and then just trim it down. And then my backer, obviously, I cut to width after I cut it to height, which was what you saw with the skill saw. And I have marks on here, so I could use a chalk line to mark where those verticals are so I could screw this perfectly into the back. So I chalk lined my 4 verticals and I just countersunk and sunk a bunch of screws in this backer, and that will hold it in place. In the original design there was already a hole pre-cut out, but the customer specifically asked for a solid backer, and they're going to drill the holes for the plumbing and all of that. So you've been seeing this for quite a while, but this is pretty much where I've been for about 6 weeks, is this finished stage. There will be some sanding to do on this, but in general this is ready for stain.